you're from, if you're a school teacher or you work in a public school or a school district, and let us know why you're here. What do you want to learn about in regards to school vouchers, privatization, and anything to do with that? And if you're from a local union, let us know which local you're from. We are also going to be taking some action later with our app Impactive. So I know most of you already have it downloaded on your phone. If not, I'll drop a link so that you can download it before we get to that point. Oh, nice. We have representation from McAllen AFT, from Houston AFT. Welcome, everyone. And Patty, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Jamie, and thank you all for sharing your evening with us. I know your time is really precious and important, but so is this very important issue that is one of the biggest threats that we've seen come our way at the Capitol in several decades, and that's private school vouchers. And for introduction, my name is Patty Quincy. I'm the Director of Public Affairs at Texas AFT. I'm also the Legislative Counsel. And we are very honored today to have Professor David DeMatthews with us. David is a professor who teaches at UT Austin right now, but has also taught at the University of Texas at El Paso. So he's seen all sorts of hijinks in Texas for a while, but he got his start as a teacher, which is really great to see in an expert and a researcher. David got his start at Baltimore Public Schools as a teacher, then moved up to the central office and special ed at District of Columbia Public Schools, and worked in administration as well there. And as a professor now at UT Austin, Professor DeMatthews focuses on school and district leadership, especially as it relates to improving schools, working conditions, and student outcomes. And this just plays in beautifully with what our respect agenda is, which is about getting the respect and the working conditions that our teachers need and deserve to be able to provide the education that our kids absolutely need and deserve. So we're very excited to have Professor DeMatthews with us today. And before we get started, just knowing the great background that you have in education and being an actual practitioner before you started all this research, I'm curious if you could tell us about your experience as an educator and administrator, and how does that relate to your current work today?
Sure. Thank you, Patty. And thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. I really appreciate being here. It means a lot to me. So I really value public school teachers. And I just want to thank everybody on the webinar tonight, because what you do really matters. And for me personally, nothing in my career has mattered more to who I am as a person than being a school teacher. So I began my career, as Patty said, as a teacher in the Baltimore City Public School District. I was also a high school basketball coach, which kind of hand in hand, being a teacher and a coach. My fondest memories really as an adult and professional. I kind of jumped ship and did something different. I went to DC Public Schools Central Office. I had some background expertise and experience in special education, and I actually worked in the school district to help improve the district's special education implementation, the implementation of IDEA. There was several challenges that we worked on. But I wanted to kind of get back away from compliance and some of the policy changes and get back to a campus and work with teachers and work with students. So I was a campus administrator at a DC public schools middle school. And really, working in central office with special education and working at the campus level was really my first interactions with what folks talk about privatization and school choice. And so about whatever it was, 15 years ago or so, 10 years ago, my first interactions with charters was as an administrator, really receiving dozens of students with IEPs after our enrollment audit, when we would have an adjustment of staff based on who was enrolled on the campus. And so, we get additional kids streaming in after this audit, but we didn't get any extra special education teachers. We didn't get any extra teachers. This was a real concern. It was something that was kind of repeatedly going on. And right from there, this whole idea of choice. So, there's not a level playing field. There's really a lot of taking advantage of public schools and the role that public schools play in communities. And I saw that up close and personal as a special ed administrator, and then as a campus administrator. And that was very frustrating and also formative for me. I was angry to see that kids were being discarded in this way, particularly students who had IEPs. So that kind of prompted me to think a little bit more broadly about the trajectory of my career. I wanted to help work with principals and teachers and districts to better prepare folks to work in the area of special ed, to be effective school leaders, to support teachers. And so I became a professor first at UT El Paso. And that was a really interesting experience, an introduction to Texas for me 10 years ago, working on the border and not only thinking about urban schools, not only thinking about students with disabilities, but also the intersection of language, of immigration status, and kind of thinking about the multiple dimensions of what it means for a public school to serve a community. And that was a unique community coming from DC for me. And about 5 years ago, I came to UT Austin, and I really focused a lot on studying school and district leadership as it relates to improving schools, working conditions, and student experiences and outcomes. But kind of going through this work, even before the pandemic, interviewing principals, visiting these really successful places across the state, you'd hear from teachers and principals just how tired they were, just how much extra resources they had to contribute. And then, something that was really concerning for me as a researcher and someone who prepares educators and leaders, folks were burning out, folks were leaving, and sustainability in terms of improving outcomes for students is so important. So I began documenting those challenges. And so my career I've kind of been on this trajectory, first really trying to identify effective practices, but now being clear that I'm documenting a lot of the barriers that educators and leaders are confronting, especially when it comes to serving marginalized communities. And then speaking out about those issues, because one thing that I felt, at least to a certain extent as a teacher and as an administrator, is that I couldn't always use my voice. And that's the privilege that I have now to be a tenured professor at a university and have the time to read, review research. I have access to all this research that's often behind paywalls. And it's really motivating me as much as possible to speak out, because vouchers in particular are very problematic. The research is very clear that they don't work, but yet we still see it being pushed as a public policy from some legislators. And so that's a little bit about who I am and also why I'm here with you today.
Thank you. And before we get into the particulars of what vouchers do to public schools and how they affect kids, and this is not a new idea, vouchers. So could you take us all the way back to when vouchers first started? What was the origin? Who was pushing it then?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is really important. And I think a lot of the voucher advocates that go around talking about this issue, they very conveniently ignore the history of vouchers and its track record. So let's kind of start where vouchers emerged. And that's in the early 1950s in Virginia. So in Prince Edward County, Virginia, in a segregated school district, they had one, really well-funded high school for white students and one segregated school for Black students that was in disrepair and not well-funded. And so the NAACP and their lawyers filed suit against Prince Edward County. And this case actually became part of the larger desegregation case that we know as Brown versus Board of Education. And in this landmark decision, the Supreme Court overturned the separate but equal doctrine, and school districts had to desegregate. It was very clear that separate was not equal. And here's what's interesting. Here's how vouchers emerged. So in response, rather than take steps to desegregate and adhere to our highest court, the Virginia State Legislature passed a series of laws to cut funding for public education for integrated schools. And they eventually created a voucher system called a tuition grant program. And that kind of even sounds familiar from what you hear folks calling things today. And what that voucher program did was it offered students the tuition cost to attend a non-sectarian private school, so a non-religious private school or a public school in another district. And then what some of those white citizens did, particularly those who did not want integrated schools, they raised additional funds to build and operate their own racially segregated private schools. And something we're going to talk about a little later is that private schools are private, so they can set their own admissions criteria. And that's what happened in this case. And so vouchers in this context enabled white students and their families to pay private school tuition and maintain racial segregation. And Black students, even with that voucher, were not permitted to attend that school. And so I want y'all to think this is actually not that long ago. We're talking about in the 50s and 60s with children, right? And so it's decades it took decades to kind of reopen these schools and repair the harm in this community. And I'd argue that harm is life lasting for the students who experienced that. And this just didn't happen in Prince Edward County. So segregated private schools that relied on vouchers, these kind of segregation academies, they popped up all over the South. So that's the origins of vouchers in the United States. It's divisive, it's rooted in racist self-interest, and it's not oriented toward an inclusive, integrated, multiracial society. And you know what? Some of today's biggest voucher advocates, they don't care about the civil rights of our most marginalized students. And I'll give an example. So Betsy DeVos, during her Senate confirmation to be Secretary of Education, she would not affirm during her Senate confirmation that she was going to protect students with disabilities who are protected under federal law from discrimination. And so that's, for me, that's really upsetting to understand, first of all, that history, and then to still hear it today by some of these backers of vouchers that they're not even willing to support students with disabilities. And so I think that should at least set the tone for where vouchers come from.
Thank you. Yeah, it's really important to remember that racist origin. What are vouchers today? You mentioned Betsy DeVos, and I know she's not the only one pushing vouchers, but they're rebranded and marketed in such a way that they sound really innocent. So how can we talk to folks, friends, neighbors, colleagues who say, what's so bad about parent choice? What's so bad about giving a parent a voucher? How do we respond to that? And who can we tell them is pushing this? Is this coming from the grassroots or is it somewhere else?
I'm glad there's so many teachers on the call. I mean, I'm sure I've never heard in my life a parent say, I want a voucher. I've heard parents say they want a caring school teacher. They want to see improvements in the public school. I've never heard parents say they want a voucher to attend private school. But let me say a little bit about what vouchers are today. So they're an education policy that uses taxpayer money to subsidize private school tuition. So the voucher can be grants that are given to parents in order to pay for private school. It could be a tax credit scholarship, or it could be some form of education savings account. And, we can't always expect the public, families, they're busy, they're working, they're shuttling kids to and from school, to sports. People are busy. The idea of choice, it sounds like a good idea. The idea of getting some sort of grant or some sort of savings account, it sounds good, but the devil is really in the details. And I'd argue that this idea of choice is a complete farce, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. One other thing for you to know, especially as you talk with people in your family and with your community, this movement, this attack on public education, I should say, with vouchers is happening in multiple states. But not all states have vouchers. So you may talk to people from other states, and they might not understand what a voucher is because their state doesn't have vouchers. And of course, a lot of education policy happens at the state and local level. And then states enact these policies in different sets of ways. And so all in all, it's a policy tool where the education dollars are going to be linked to where the student actually attends school. And so if that student is in a public school, the school receives funding for that student. If they move to a private school, the money leaves the public school. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about why that is so problematic and why voucher advocates, they also gloss over the impact of what that actually means for public schools. So that's just a very brief overlay of vouchers. What you said one other thing too. I'm sorry. So who's pushing them? So yeah, I've not seen any research, and I've not heard from any parents saying I want a voucher. What we tend to see is a lot of external folks from other states with political agendas or vested interests. They own a private school or some sort of private school network, or they have some sort of religious agenda that they're trying to push that are really backing these things. And so it's a lot of folks not from our state. And Texas is a unique, diverse state. I mean, what kids might be interested in and what families might be interested in or need in the Panhandle could be very different than South Texas or Houston or in El Paso, right? And so the idea that billionaires from other states are campaigning to affect what happens in local communities around how children are educated, that just also is extremely problematic. It's anti-democratic. And I think that needs to be called out specifically. Why are these folks getting involved in what is a local issue that should be between parents, locally elected school boards, superintendents, principals, and teachers? Not, they have no room in this space.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, these are not grassroots organizations. These are what we call AstroTurf organizations that are really well funded, that are painted to look like it's a parent or some kind of a real authentic person approaching. So yeah, thanks for that background. And regarding the research, vouchers have been around for a while. How has the research changed from when they first started out to current time? How does that change through time?
Could I just say one more thing? I just want to
Sure.
point out a difference between public and private schools. But I think it's really important, and I also think that is often left out of the framing of these of vouchers for folks who are supporting vouchers. And so everybody should just know and be able to explain this. Public schools are taxpayer funded. They're overseen by publicly elected officials. They're open to every child in the community, and they have to comply with all local, state, and federal laws. And private schools don't. There's all different types of private schools, but the fact is they don't have to. And so I just want to say that before we talk about the research, it doesn't even make sense, given that there's these differences between public and private schools. And by the way, private schools do not outperform public schools. We really had to ask ourselves, why would we even think about giving taxpayer money to privately run schools that are not held accountable to the same laws, to the programmatic civil rights and governance standards that public schools are? So I just wanted to say that and put that on the table.
Yeah, definitely worth reiterating that parents and students lose all of their due process protections, especially if they're in special ed, if they were to switch to a private school voucher. So So why is there so much talk about vouchers? I mean, is there some sort of new research that says this is a great idea? Why is this bandied about so much?
Yeah, so researchers and have been studying this for a while, and 20 years ago, some of the early voucher studies actually showed some success raising student achievement, and I point that out because you got to be careful about where you get your information from, and I think folks can be easily misled. They can see an article or they can see somebody, a professor, somebody from a think tank, or even a journalist inadvertently referencing a study from 20 years ago that says that, this had a positive effect. But 20 years ago, these programs, all in all, were very small pilot programs. And so in these small private programs, there wasn't new private schools being created. It wasn't dealing with a large group of students. But as vouchers have proliferated in a few different states, and I'll talk about that, it was a larger body of students needing to be served over a longer period of time. And that's where some of the real serious concerns with vouchers kind of come into view. And so more recent peer-reviewed studies, some funded by the federal government, not funded by, the political left or political right, they find that these voucher programs have significant negative impact on student achievement. The biggest negative impact is for students who are the most economically disadvantaged. And they found this in studies in Washington, D.C., in Indiana, in Louisiana, in Ohio. And what is really interesting, if you kind of get into the fine print, if you have enough time as I do as a professor to just sit back and read, even research funded by some of the right-wing think tanks, they've come to the same conclusion. They don't go around advertising it, but there's a little bit of research integrity there. So if you kind of read through everything, and they explain it, they have their rationale for why, but it's there. And so there's really not a lot to discuss when it comes to the research, that these programs just don't work. So what really is happening, it's kind of a no-brainer. New private schools open up when there's an opportunity to make some money, to meet that existing demand, because the existing private schools were not built to all of a sudden admit a whole large group of students. Some private schools, they don't want to admit more students. They've built the private school that they want to. That's why they created a private school, and they're not looking to serve different communities. They may have one or two available slots. And so new schools need to open. And what happens in that policy environment is there's a lack of oversight from the state and from the organizations, a new organization, a fledgling organization that has to recruit people in order to even open its doors and stay alive, is not necessarily going to be the best way to have a school operate. They tend to poorly perform because they don't have all their ducks in a row. And then they often close quickly at the detriment to students and taxpayers. And so if you were surprised that vouchers would have this significant negative impact, it's not because today's existing private schools are terrible. Like public and private schools tend to perform similarly, but it's when you open these floodgates to all sorts of individuals, that's where the problem really comes in. And Texas is the worst place to do this because there were 43,000 teacher vacancies in Texas at the end of last year. And so I don't understand what our policymakers who are supporting vouchers are thinking. How would opening up more private schools help education? And how would that provide a choice? Where are these teachers coming from? I think regardless of what side you are on most issues in education, you know that teachers are the most important thing. And so the idea of opening more schools amid a massive teacher shortage just doesn't make any sense. And then I want to touch on a couple more issues. So more importantly, research makes clear that students with disabilities are negatively impacted, and we know who's also tends to be served in these programs. So several studies show that students who use vouchers, they're not students with disabilities, and they're not the most economically disadvantaged students, which is what a lot of voucher proponents say. they tend to be the students who come from the most affluent backgrounds and who are already attending private school. And so vouchers end up being a subsidy for wealthy families. And since most vouchers don't cover the cost of a lot of private schools, especially higher performing private schools, economically disadvantaged students they don't benefit at all. They actually now go to a school with less funds, while wealthy families get a tax subsidy. And so that doesn't make any sense. A few more things. So those most economically disadvantaged students, they're least likely to use vouchers, as I said. When they do use them, they tend to struggle, and they tend to leave. And here's the kicker, right? That should really be the nails in the coffin here. When they return back to public schools, researchers find they tend to do better than they did when they were in that private school with a voucher. And so, I feel like it's we're beating a dead horse talking about research here. It's very, very clear that vouchers do not work. They do not serve students well, and they have a negative impact on public schools. And so I feel like anybody who says so, I mean, they're really telling lies. And I think what you're seeing now, a lot of attacks on teachers. So saying that public schools and public school teachers are grooming kids or indoctrinating them or sharing pornographic material or teaching them to hate their country. They're doing this because they're trying to advance these privatization issues, and they don't have evidence. So they have to use fear tactics. They have to attack public schools. They can't do it on the merits of their case. They can't do it on the merits of their policy. And so I think that's also a way in which it's very, very clear that vouchers as a policy tool just doesn't work at all.
Thank you. Yeah, you're right. It is about fear and about distraction. And it seems that the folks who are pushing vouchers would very much love to demonize public schools, shut them down, and privatize the whole thing. I mean, it's kind of part of the business model is to kind of blame and demonize educators. Can you explain a little bit about how the funding, opening up a whole new private school system in Texas, how could that actually harm our public schools?
Yeah, well, before we even talk about what vouchers could do, right, let's talk about just the context of Texas school finance. So Texas ranks as one of the worst states when it comes to funding high poverty school districts. So Texas is a very regressive state. Even though we have recapture, when all is said and done and you look at how the poorest school districts in Texas are funded versus the wealthiest, there's a significant disparity. And so that's a concern right from the jump, that we don't have an equitable or adequate system of school finance in the first place. So given this current state, we should ask ourselves, can Texas even afford to deviate from this like status quo and kind of put more stress on this already underfunded system? Obviously they can't. But I want to talk about some like smaller districts I think are disproportionately hurt. So larger districts have more students. They potentially have a little bit more flexibility given they benefit from what's called like an economy of scale. And so they're able to use their resources in ways that are more efficient than smaller schools and school districts can. So let me explain what fixed costs are. So fixed costs really help explain just how vouchers will have an extremely negative impact on public schools. So besides the fact that it doesn't work for students who use vouchers and go to private schools, it also is going to have a detrimental effect on public schools. So fixed costs basically means that like a public school's cost does not change or is not directly tied or associated with the exact number of students they serve from year to year. So I want y'all to imagine a rural school district that receives about $10,000 per student per year and serves 1,000 students across pre-K through 12. If that school loses just 20 students to vouchers, that means the money that is tied to that student goes to the private school, and the school district loses that money. They could lose about, say, 20 kids $200,000. That's multiple teachers that are going to have to be cut, or many things are going to have to be cut as a result of that. And so what happens is, so now you have already struggling small school districts, and they're receiving fewer dollars, but their costs haven't changed. You know, those 20 kids spread out across 5 or 6 or 7 or 12 grades. That's not going to change much about the school. Still going to need the same staffing model that it had, you know, the prior year before vouchers were enacted. So that is very, very problematic. It's disturbing because we're in such a poorly funded system. There's not a lot of wiggle room to cut anymore. And so I think Texans should really be disturbed about the potential for that to happen. And just so you know, I mean, we think of Texas as being this urban state now with these large cities, but there's 636 school districts in Texas that have 1,000 students or less. And that's more than half of the school districts in the state. And so this if vouchers happen, these 636 districts, and really, I mean, districts with 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, they're all put at great risk just by losing a few students. And then also, I do want to highlight another reason why vouchers harm public schools. So vouchers and other choice programs like charter schools often promote, not always, but often, more times than not, when you look at the data, promote discrimination against students with disabilities, because private schools do not have to serve students with disabilities, and they can have their own admission criteria. That's fine when taxpayers are not covering the bill. They're entitled to create this. It's a private school. It's privately run. It's privately operated. But when taxpayer dollars go to that, that's very problematic. But here's what also will happen with vouchers, and we see this kind of play out in a lot of states. Public schools are then expected to serve a higher proportion of students with disabilities because those private schools are not taking those students. And those students are more costly to educate. So now the school district has a higher proportion of students who are more costly to educate, but they have less money because now vouchers are funding private school tuition, mostly for wealthy kids in the district. So that doesn't make sense as a policy choice. That's what's really kind of frustrating for me when folks say that this is about parental choice. I say, what rational Texas parent would want the choice to send their child to a school that doesn't perform as well as their public school, to promote discrimination against children with disabilities, and to take money out of the public education system? I don't think that's a choice at all. I think that's a scam. I think it's a farce, and I think it's disgusting.
How do you really feel about it, Professor? Thank you. But here's another question. You brought this up a little earlier. How is it that charter schools are a similar threat to private school vouchers?
Yeah, well, so I don't know if everybody's been watching the news, but in relatively speaking, in similar ways. And so the same ways that vouchers would kind of take money out of public schools is very similar to the way that charters take money out of public schools. And you know, TEA and a lot of other states, they have really struggled to effectively monitor and regulate and oversee charter schools. The U.S. government has put out multiple reports saying that the federal government's own charter school grants program can't assure that those funds are actually being used as they're intended to. So that there's these great financial auditing risks that are a concern. That's a national issue. And if we look at what has transpired in Texas, I actually think some of what's been happening in Texas with charters, if a voucher law was passed, we would see some of this same behavior go on. And so in the past, some of y'all can recall that idea of public charter schools purchased San Antonio Spurs luxury box. I think when their CEO left, received some compensation package of over $800,000 or $900,000. There's a lot of other kind of expenditures. And then just recently, I think it was the San Antonio Express News broke a story about some different charter networks in Texas purchasing a $12 million horse ranch from former Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, the Exxon CEO, purchasing luxury condos that were listed in financial documents as storage facilities, or just wealthy individuals who own private schools, having the private schools fund, or having the charter schools pay rent in buildings that they actually own. And we've seen other examples of this as well. Public schools aren't perfect. Y'all are teachers, you know that things come up. But the point is, when things don't go right, there is an accountability mechanism that starts with the democratically elected school board, that includes the state, that includes all this, and there's all this transparency that is required as being a part of a public agency, conflict of interest. There's a variety of things that charters don't necessarily tend not to have, and that private schools won't have. And so when something goes wrong in the public school system, a parent, a journalist, they can complain, they can access information. It's far less transparent with charter schools and with private schools. And of course, private schools, this is not, I don't want to attack private schools. They weren't designed to be, they're not public schools. They're designed, for their own ends. So they don't need to be accountable to the government. The problem is, if there's this transfer of funding from public system, that's taxpayer dollars, into these systems, then there needs to be, but there's not. And TEA has not shown that they can effectively oversee any organization, really. They've pretty persistently failed at catching these things. We've had to rely on journalists and teachers and whistleblowers to actually raise concerns. And so I think vouchers would open up a terrible can of worms when it comes to fraud and financial mismanagement. And that would only hurt Texas kids at the end of the day.
Right. It's just a one family budget is the way I look at it. And if you invite a grifter to the table, there's not going to be enough for someone else. So yeah, thank you for explaining that. And we know that that Texas is kind of targeted. There's a huge voucher fight. We're under attack. Are there any kind of last thoughts you have to kind of sum up before we take some questions from the chat and our participants?
Yeah, I think there's some internal folks that are pushing these issues, and there's some external folks that are pushing vouchers. But I just want to reiterate to everybody that they're not rooted in evidence. Honestly, if there was research that said that vouchers improve student achievement outcomes, serve students with disabilities at a high level, I'd be all for them. That I'm not ideological. If that worked, if there was evidence that worked, I would think that's fantastic. But that's just not the case. I'm sorry that teachers have to take the brunt of this attack, because the people who are pushing vouchers have nothing else to stand on but to attack public schools. And so when you talk to people, I would just say, public schools they're imperfect, and they always have been, but a strong universal public education is vital to our nation, to our state, to our democracy, and really to guaranteeing the right that every child has a free, high quality education. That's what public schools promise and deliver every day. And when people say, when voucher supporters say that, like, parents want choice, that's not even rooted in history. Millions of Americans across generations have fought to create, improve, gain access to the public school system because of its purpose and its potential. So I think really, I hope we can get past this as quickly as possible and focus on, this is a distraction really from collective effort in our state with a massive budget surplus to actually do the things that matter for children. And that's, improving funding, improving principal and teacher quality, enhancing those working conditions, improving the curriculum. I think that's what needs to happen. And we need to get away from this wasted time that we're spending and energy and emotion on a failed policy like vouchers.
Right. Well, thank you so much. And let's see, Jamie, do we have any questions from participants in the chat?
Yeah, I've got a few questions from the chat, and if anybody else has any questions, feel free to raise your hand or throw it in the chat. We might get to it. It looks like our first, well, we have more of a comment, but we have Kimmy and Gio on here. They say that their husband teaches at a private school, and they notice that students tend to move in and out between public schools and private schools a lot. Do you have any idea of why that is? Why they go back and forth a lot once they try private school?
Yeah, so my husband's a band director at Prince of Peace in Carrollton, and that's not necessarily by choice. I know that he would actually like to be in a public school. I'm a huge public school proponent. It's just that band directing positions, music, are not, there's just not very many positions for that. But with regard to your question, some of them will move. I'm thinking of one student he told me about that wanted to go to, so the public schools in North Texas have very competitive band programs and marching band programs. And that is a very keeping up with the Joneses kind of thing, where they want their kids to go to the really competitive and big marching band programs. And sometimes they'll come back and say to my husband, well, why can't Prince of Peace can't have a marching band program like that? Well, it's because the private schools don't have a culture of music and arts a lot of times, and it's just not competitive like that, and they don't egg each other on, and it's a whole culture at public school. So that's one reason, and then I can't think of any other reasons that he's cited to me recently, but I know that they do move in and out for whatever reason or reasons between public and private school.
Yeah, that's a great point, and something to remember is that they can discriminate for any reason too. So there's no telling how many of those kids were expelled. What we've seen in charters, at least, even so-called public school charters, are they can expel kids for any minor infraction, and there's really kind of no recourse because there's no locally elected school board to go complain to. So yeah, it's a really important thing to remember is that they discriminate, and they also don't offer the programming that many public schools want and many public school parents want. So I can see how parents would kind of be disappointed in moving to a private school and want to move back.
And one thing that you see happens, right? At the end of the day, the public school always takes the child back, right? Because public schools serve their community, they guarantee access to every child. So it's problematic to hear that you don't want kids bouncing from school to school to school, right? That's problematic for that child's trajectory for a variety of reasons. But at the end of the day, the public school is always there to kind of pick up the pieces, and that's a cost. That's hard for teachers to pick up new students at different times of the year. That's an extra burden that I think folks don't talk about when it comes to these choice models that can push students out in the middle of the year. That just adds to the challenges of the public school teacher.
Looks like we have Cindy with her hand raised. Cindy, you have a question? You can go ahead and come off mute.
It's not really a question, but I've had a lot of experience working with charter schools, and they're thieves. They rip off our government. They treat their teachers poorly. They are, one of the schools that I worked at wanted the attendance on paper. And I said, well, this is just a few years ago. And I said, why do you have to do it on paper? Everybody else in the country has been using the computer for years. Well, I realized they wanted it on paper because that way they could change the numbers of those who were absent so they could get more money for the attendance. They don't offer, they get recess. There's no sports, PE, music, nothing cultural. One of the charters I worked at, like you were saying, the owner well, she made so much money off of her own charter school that she would take the entire faculty up to Oklahoma so that they could go gambling up there. She's taken them on cruises. She bought her own bus company so that her school could use those buses. And I'm Jewish. She wouldn't let me off for my high holiday. She told me that I seemed to have a hard time learning new policies. And then a month later, when I was sick, got a note from the doctor, came back to school. They said, no, this is not a good note. I had to go back and get a second note from the doctor, came back, and they said, no, that was not a good note either. And a third time I came back, they said the owner wanted to meet with me. So I went to the meeting, took my phone with me, of course, had it recording underneath the table. And besides telling me how, I was just lying about my doctor, I was on their letterhead. She brought up, you just can't seem to follow directions, just like asking off for your holidays, which I had on tape. So I was able to turn around and sue her. And then, eventually, I could go on and on and on about terrible things that they've done at that one. I've been at 3 or 4 schools. Every one of them were terrible. That particular school, her husband was involved. What did he do? We don't know. Her 2 adult children were involved. What did they do? The daughter was put in charge of pre-K curriculum. She didn't have kids. She knew nothing. She wanted us to give them spelling tests. We said, they don't even know how to write their names yet. Anyway.
Cindy, there's so many stories that we actually have a hashtag on Twitter that is hashtag another day, another charter scandal.
Yeah.
Because every day it's another story. And we included
Right.
one in there about the equestrian horses. But yeah, we need to bring you into the legislature for them to hear exactly what kind of waste and fraud is going on, because it's
Yeah.
quite unnerving to see them flying around in private planes, right? While you're reaching into your pocket, buying pencils and breakfast bars for your kids.
Yes.
So these are exactly the kind of things that are the ways that they're stealing, robbing from our public schools.
Yes, they are.
So-
And just so happens that person and her husband were both caught, and they are now serving time in jail.
Yeah, that's the thing. Imagine, any of these stories that we're talking about charter schools, if we heard of a real public school board buying an equestrian center for $12 million, these people would be in jail immediately.
Yeah.
This is
Just couldn't make that, yeah.
incredible the way there's just 2 very different standards. But thank you so much for your comments, Cindy.
Mhm.
And Jamie, did we have anyone else?
Yes, I have Bill Thomas from Northside AFT has a question about test scores. When it comes to test scores between charter and public schools, are we not building 2 roads to the same place? And please discuss a little bit about test scores.
I'm not sure what 2 roads to the same place means. I don't know if the person who asked that could clarify.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, basically from what I'm reading, that test scores are not that much different. Maybe the charter schools in the very high income areas do pretty well, but on the average, they're not getting any better test scores than the public schools.
Yeah.
Do you have anything extra to add on that?
That's correct. So what we tend to see in research that focuses on comparing charters to public schools is that charter schools do not outperform public schools. And you kind of tend to see the same variation. And you see the same variation actually with private schools, that there are some public schools that are doing really well. And there are some charter schools that are doing really well. There are some public schools that are struggling, and there are some charter schools that are struggling. When you look across like a state and all the charters and all the public schools that are there so in that regard, yeah, why we would finance a second pathway that takes money away from public education, but doesn't improve outcomes in any way, doesn't really make much sense overall. But it's been something that a lot of policymakers have from both political parties for a long time have supported in terms of charters. I think that's changing a little bit because, again, the evidence is really clear that charters don't actually perform as well. And I would say the big charter management organizations have figured out ways to ensure that they have a very different student population than the public schools. And so it's also not a level playing field. Public schools are asked to do more, asked to serve a more diverse group of students with more unique needs, provide all the specials, programs, athletics, band, programs for students with all different types of disabilities and needs, English language learners, where this separate system that doesn't do any better underserves those groups. And so that is also, really, really problematic. So we see that just at a general level, charters don't outperform, but public schools also kind of take this heavier burden.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and charters, it's important to remember, can and do discriminate in admissions. In fact, just asking about a child's special education IEP plan is kind of has a chilling effect. And a parent is kind of known, at the admissions form that their child is probably not going to get their needs met there at that school. So it's really frustrating that even though they can discriminate and send back a lot of the kids without the money, they still don't manage to even perform at the same level as public schools, even though they get a funding advantage too.
And I would say that they're legally not allowed to discriminate against children with disabilities or English language learners. They are federally protected. But what you said is when you look at the data, when you look at who enrolls in these schools, and when you look even closer about who gets pushed out of these schools very quickly, or if you just look at how the schools are funded and what programs they have, you see that very clearly many of these large charter management organizations are not serving their actual communities. They're only offering choice for a select group of people, and they're not creating a broad array of programs to meet the diverse needs of a community and a student population. And so they're breaking the law. I just want to say they're breaking the law. Private schools, they wouldn't be breaking the law by discriminating, but charter schools, when they discriminate against children with disabilities, they're breaking the law.
Yeah, and when we talk about school choice, they try and talk about, parents deserve school choice, but it's really just the schools that have the choice in school choice. So thank you so much for your comments. And Jamie, are there any last questions? I think we need to kind of wrap up soon.
Yeah,
and stay tuned. We're going to do a legislative advocacy action after this too. So I hope you're good and mad and ready to do something about it.
Yeah, speaking of that, I would say our last question I'll add is from Arnetta Murray, which is, when do we go and talk to state reps about this? And we've floated this link in the chat a bunch, but we have a sign up form online. If you're interested in testifying at the Capitol, please sign up and we'll get you all the details you need.
Yes, thank you. And please post those links too. There's many ways to get involved. You can come testify at the Capitol, which is a great way to give your firsthand testimony on how your classroom is underfunded, what your working conditions are like, and how opening up this new revenue stream is going to take even more money from your local schools. You can also submit written testimony, also letters to the editors, making visits to your legislators, either at the district or at the Capitol. We can help you get involved in that, but I cannot stress enough that you are our most powerful weapon that we have in our fight against privatization and against these profiteers who would love to destroy our public schools. So please stick around, and we hope to, there's this link to sign up to testify, but like I said, there's so many ways to get involved and stay involved, and please sign up for our legislative hotline. This is an email newsletter we send out every Friday. I was at the Capitol today and heard from legislators who love reading our hotline and seeing our kind of good bills roundup of the week. So please make sure to get involved that way too. But And of course, follow Professor DeMatthews on Twitter. We've got his Twitter handle. He has such really important information that he can kind of put in a concise way on Twitter, and it's really easy to share with friends and family. So please do that as well. And I would think, Professor Matthews, I think that's all the time we have for our questions. But I want to thank you again for your time and for the great work that you do training new educators, and thank you for being in the fight with us as well.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for all that you're doing, and thank you everybody for the service you're doing to your community. Even though it might sound like a lot of folks are attacking public ed, I know most of the people in the public are behind you. So just keep doing what you're doing, and lift your voice, because your voice is needed.
Thank you.
All
Are
right.
y'all staying on to talk about anything?
Yes, we have an action. Actually, we have 2 actions that we would love for everyone to stay and take with us.
Okay.
Patty, are we good to start our actions?
Yes, we are.
All right. So if you've been on one of these calls before, especially recently, you know that we've used Impactive to text. And so if you have that downloaded already,